Experts spot something disturbing in 1950s. Photo, zooming, they get the fright of their lives. A haunting discovery from decades past sends chills down the spines of modern-day analysts. What seemed like an innocent family portrait harbors a dark secret that remained hidden until technology revealed the unthinkable. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the basement of the Briarville Historical Society. Professor Michael Turner rubbed his tired eyes, the hours of staring at his computer screen taking their toll. Beside him, Emily Carter huddled in her cardigan, fighting off the perpetual chill that seemed embedded in these underground walls. "How many more boxes do we have left?" Emily asked, her voice barely rising above the hum of the ancient heating system. The historian's dedication matched Michael's own, both committed to preserving the town's forgotten past through their digitization project. "Too many," Michael replied with a wry smile, adjusting his glasses. "A century of records doesn't scan itself." Emily nodded, reaching for another unmarked cardboard box. The dust made her sneeze as she pried open the lid. "Most of these are just tax records from the 60s, she muttered, but then paused, her fingers brushing against something different at the bottom. "Wait, what's this?" She carefully extracted a black-and-white photograph, remarkably well-preserved despite its age. "Michael, look at this. It's from the Briarville Girls' Academy, dated 1951. The professor wheeled his chair closer, their shoulders nearly touching as they examined the image. 24 young girls stood in perfect formation against a brick wall, their uniforms impeccably pressed. Expressions solemn. Behind them stood a stern-faced teacher, her hand resting on the shoulder of a girl in the front row. "It's in remarkable condition," Emily whispered, handling it by the edges. "Let's scan it at the highest resolution." Michael nodded, taking the photograph with careful hands and placing it on the scanner bed. "These might be the daughters of some of Briarville's founding families," he said, his academic curiosity piqued. The academy was quite prestigious back then. The scanner hummed to life, and seconds later the image appeared on his monitor. Ever meticulous, Michael zoomed in to check the clarity, moving systematically across the photograph. "The detail is incredible," he murmured, enlarging a section showing the girls' faces. "You can almost feel their—" His words died abruptly. The professor's finger froze over the mouse, his body suddenly rigid. "What is it?" Emily leaned closer, concerned by his reaction. "There," he said, voice barely audible, "on the waistband of that girl's skirt." Emily squinted at the screen, then gasped, nearly invisible to the naked eye. A small cloth tag had been carefully stitched into the uniform, bearing a string of numbers. "Why would a school uniform have a code like that?" she whispered. Michael's expression darkened. "I don't know. But something tells me we weren't meant to see it." Emily Carter's heart hammered against her ribs as she leaned closer to the monitor, her fingers trembling slightly. The tag's numbers flickered into focus under the scanner's glow, 7 digits, meticulously stitched in thread barely distinguishable from the uniform fabric. "Michael, look at this," she whispered, her voice tight. "Why would a school uniform need such a code? And why hide it so carefully?" Professor Turner adjusted his glasses, squinting at the screen. His methodical mind was already cataloguing possibilities. Military schools sometimes used identification systems, but Briarville Girls' Academy had been a prestigious civilian institution, known for educating daughters of the town's most prominent families. "It's almost like—" he began, then stopped himself. "Like what?" Emily pressed. Like someone was tracking them," Michael finished, his expression darkening. "Not the school itself, perhaps, but someone within the system." The Historical Society's basement felt suddenly colder, the hum of the scanner, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Emily wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, unable to shake the feeling that they'd stumbled onto something deliberately concealed. "We need to check the school records," Michael said, already moving toward the filing cabinets where Briarville's educational archives were meticulously organized. If these numbers were some kind of internal identification system, there should be a master list or explanation. They spent the next 3 hours methodically combing through yellowed folders and bound ledgers. Emily focused on administrative records while Michael examined student registries, both searching for any reference to numbered identification systems. "Oh, this doesn't make sense," Michael muttered finally, closing another dusty binder. "The Academy's records are famously complete. The board prided itself on documentation." Emily looked up from her own stack of papers. "Except they're not complete, are they? The files from 1951 are missing. Not just incomplete, gone entirely." Michael stood up straight, the realization hitting him like a physical force. In 15 years of historical research in Briarville, he'd never encountered a gap in the town's meticulous record-keeping. "Someone removed them," he said quietly, deliberately. Emily nodded slowly, her historian's instincts firing warning signals. This town has always presented itself as having an immaculate history, the perfect American community. "And we just found the first crack in that facade," Michael finished, staring at the photograph still displayed on the screen. The girl with the numbered tag stared back at them, her expression unreadable, her secrets buried for over 70 years. But secrets, as both historians knew, rarely stayed buried forever. Emily Carter spent a restless night, her mind filled with the mysterious tag they'd discovered. By dawn, she knew she had to return to the Briarville Historical Society alone. The photograph called to her, its secrets demanding to be uncovered. The basement archives felt different in the early morning light, more secretive. As if the building itself was holding its breath, Emily unlocked the door with trembling hands, the key scraping loudly in the silence. She made her way to their workstation, where the photograph from 1951 still sat beside the scanner. "There has to be more," she whispered to herself, adjusting the desk lamp to cast better light on the image. Emily zoomed in methodically, section by section, scrutinizing every inch of the 24 girls in their academy uniforms. Her historian's eye missed nothing: the brick pattern behind them, the subtle differences in their postures, the way some avoided the camera's gaze. 3 hours into her examination, Emily nearly missed it. There, at the edge of a sleeve cuff belonging to a girl in the back row, another tag, different from the first, but unmistakably deliberate. Her fingers trembled as she magnified the image further, revealing another sequence of numbers, carefully stitched into the fabric. "Oh my God," she breathed, her coffee growing cold beside her. This wasn't coincidence. This was systematic. Emily quickly cross-referenced the two girls with the tags. They stood apart in the photograph, not side by side. Different heights, different hair, nothing to connect them visually. Yet someone had marked them both, hidden the marks in different locations on their uniforms. She grabbed her notebook, sketching the positions of the girls, noting where the tags appeared. A pattern was emerging, one that made her skin crawl. These weren't random identifiers. Someone at Briarville Girls Academy had been tracking specific students, marking them like inventory. The basement suddenly felt colder, the shadows deeper. Emily glanced over her shoulder, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. The walls of the archive, lined with decades of the town's history, seemed to press closer, as if the building itself was listening to her discoveries. Weighing whether she should be allowed to continue, Emily reached for her phone to call Michael Turner, then hesitated. She needed more evidence before bringing him in. Whatever had happened at the academy, whatever system these tags represented, it was bigger and darker than either of them had imagined. Michael Turner knew they needed expert help. After a restless night filled with visions of those mysterious numbers, he called his former university colleague, Detective Richard Hayes. Though retired for nearly 3 years, Hayes had built his reputation solving cold cases that others had long abandoned. "I wouldn't bother you if it wasn't important," Michael explained over the phone, his voice tight with urgency. The professor described their discovery in careful detail, emphasizing the hidden tags they'd found in the photograph. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," Richard replied without hesitation. True to his word, the detective arrived at the Briarville Historical Society at precisely 9 o'clock. Despite his retirement, Hayes carried himself with the same methodical precision that had made him legendary in law enforcement circles. His weathered face showed the lines of someone who had seen too many unsolved mysteries, and his salt and pepper hair was cropped close to his scalp. Emily Carter watched as the two men embraced briefly, years of mutual respect evident in their greeting. The detective placed his battered leather notebook on the table, the same one he'd carried for 20 years of service. "Show me everything," he said, pulling out a pair of reading glasses. Michael guided his old friend to the computer where the enlarged photograph glowed on the screen. He pointed out each hidden tag they'd discovered, explaining their theories about the numbered codes. Richard leaned forward, squinting at the screen. His pen moved rapidly across the notebook page as he documented every detail. The historian noticed how he occasionally paused to rub the bridge of his nose, a habit from years of scrutinizing evidence. "Numbers like these," he murmured after several minutes of examination, "usually mean someone's keeping track off the books." He tapped his pen against the page. "In my experience, when people hide identification this way, they're creating a system that exists outside official records." Emily felt a chill at his words. "What kind of system?" The detective's eyes met hers. "That's what we need to find out. But I've seen similar methods in trafficking cases, where victims become numbers instead of names." Michael's face paled. "These were schoolgirls, Richard." "Which makes it all the more disturbing," Hayes replied, his voice dropping lower. "Whatever happened at Briarville Girls' Academy? Someone went to great lengths to code these children while keeping it hidden from casual observation." The three of them exchanged grim looks, understanding that their investigation had just taken a darker turn. The quiet basement of the Historical Society suddenly felt like the beginning of something much larger and much more sinister than they had initially imagined. Emily Carter spent the entire weekend buried in the archives, her determination growing with each dusty file she examined. Her breakthrough came Monday morning when her fingers, now stained with decades-old ink, discovered a brittle yellow memorandum dated March 1957. The document, its edges crumbling at her touch, detailed the transfer of 5 girls from the Briarville Home for Children. Their destinations were marked simply as alternative care facilities, with no further explanation. "Michael, look at this," she called across the basement, her voice echoing against the concrete walls. Professor Turner abandoned his cataloguing and hurried over, adjusting his glasses as he leaned in to examine her find. The historian pointed to the redacted names, thick black lines obscuring identities, but the dates remained clear. "These transfers happened 6 years after our photograph was taken. But look at the reference numbers." She slid the memo beside their enhanced image of the photograph. "The coding system matches the tags we found on the uniforms." Michael's hands trembled as he compared the documents. The connection was undeniable. The numerical sequence followed the same pattern. "These aren't just random identifiers," he whispered, his academic detachment giving way to genuine horror. They're tracking numbers. Emily nodded grimly. The academy wasn't just a school. It was processing these girls somehow. The professor paced the narrow aisle between filing cabinets, his mind racing. If these 5 girls from the memo are among the 24 in our photograph... He couldn't finish the sentence. Then the official record is a lie. Emily completed his thought. These children didn't just vanish or get transferred. They were at the academy first, documented in this photograph, then systematically removed from the records. Michael returned to the computer monitor, enlarging different sections of the photograph. The faces of the girls stared back at him, some solemn, others with forced smiles. He couldn't help but wonder which ones had disappeared without a trace. "We need to identify every girl in this picture," Emily said, her voice steady despite the weight of their discovery. Someone deliberately hid these children in plain sight, then erased them from history. The revelations settled over them like a physical presence. The secret wasn't buried in some hidden document they had yet to find. It was literally staring back at them from the photograph itself. The girls, arranged in neat rows, had been silently witnessing their own erasure for over 70 years. "We should call Richard," Michael said finally, reaching for his phone. "This just became much bigger than a historical curiosity." Emily nodded. Already making notes, the Historical Society's quiet project had just transformed into something far more urgent, the unraveling of a conspiracy that had successfully buried the truth for generations. Emily Carter spent 3 days calling the state's social welfare office, her desk at the Briarville Historical Society littered with sticky notes and coffee cups. Each call ended the same way: polite refusals, redirections to departments that didn't exist, or promises of callbacks that never came. "They're stonewalling me," she told Michael Turner, slamming down the phone after her 14th attempt. The historian's normally composed demeanor had given way to visible frustration. Every record request about the academy girls is being denied without explanation. They won't even acknowledge these files should exist. Michael nodded grimly, watching his colleague pace the archive room. "Bureaucracy moves slowly." "But this feels deliberate," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Someone doesn't want these connections made." Emily's persistence only met more resistance. When she drove to the state capitol to make her request in person, the clerk's smile never reached her eyes as she explained that files from that era were, unfortunately, damaged in a basement flood. When Emily asked to see documentation of this convenient disaster, the woman's smile disappeared completely. "I'm sorry, but I'll need you to leave now," was all she said, her finger hovering near what Emily assumed was a security button. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes was working his own angles. The retired detective still maintained relationships with former colleagues across 3 counties. Over lunch at a diner outside Briarville, an old police academy friend slid a napkin across the table. "This is off the record," the man whispered, glancing nervously around the nearly empty restaurant. But there was an agreement back then. The academy took in girls from the state orphanage, the difficult cases, the ones nobody wanted to adopt. Richard's weathered face remained impassive as he memorized the information. Under what terms? Strict confidentiality. The academy got state funding, the orphanage cleared beds, and the paperwork disappeared. Perfect arrangement for everyone except the girls. The man stood to leave. "That's all I know." And we never had this conversation. When Richard shared this information with Emily and Michael at their makeshift investigation center in the basement archive, Emily's hands trembled with a mixture of vindication and horror. "So the academy was essentially purchasing these girls," Michael said, his voice hollow. Emily shook her head. "Not purchasing, acquiring, like assets." She pinned another note to their growing evidence board. And the state helped erase their identities. Richard's jaw tightened. We need to find someone who worked at either institution during that period, someone who might talk. If they're still alive, Emily added softly, and if they're not still afraid. The basement of the Briarville Historical Society had become their second home. Emily Carter, Michael Turner, and Richard Hayes huddled around the computer monitor well past midnight, the blue light casting ghostly shadows across their tired faces. The enlarged scan of the 1951 photograph dominated the screen, each pixel now the size of a small pebble as they searched for anything they might have missed. "Wait!" Emily said suddenly, her finger hovering over a specific section. "Can you zoom in more on this girl's blazer?" Michael adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, clicking to magnify the area. The fabric's weave became visible, and there, partially hidden inside an inner pocket that had folded outward during the photograph, were tiny embroidered initials. M. Evans. M. Evans. Emily repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She scrambled for the folder containing the police memorandum they'd uncovered days earlier. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. "Here it is," she gasped, pointing to a name in the document. Mary Evans, according to official records. She died in a fire at the state orphanage in 1954, 3 years after this photograph was taken. Richard took the memo, his weathered detective's eyes narrowing as he compared the dates. This doesn't make sense. How could she have died in a fire if she was at the academy? She couldn't have, Michael said, his face paling in the dim light. Either the records are wrong, or someone deliberately falsified them, Emily finished. The weight of the implications settling over the room like a shroud. The former detective paced the small space between filing cabinets, his notebook open in his palm. If Mary Evans was alive and at the academy when they claimed she died elsewhere, we're not just looking at missing records. We're looking at a cover-up, Michael said, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. The historian felt a chill run through him. His entire career had been built on trusting documentation, on the belief that even flawed records held kernels of truth. But this was different. This was intentional deception. Emily stared at the girl in the photograph, trying to memorize her features. Mary Evans had dark hair pulled back severely, her expression neither smiling nor frowning, just empty, as though she'd already disappeared while still being photographed. "Someone wanted these girls forgotten," Richard muttered, scribbling furiously in his notebook. "The question is, why fake a death instead of just a transfer?" Emily looked up, her eyes meeting Michael's across the table. "Because dead girls don't get looked for," she said softly. "And whatever happened at that academy, someone made sure nobody would ever come looking." The morning began like any other at the Briarville Historical Society, until the receptionist called Emily Carter about a package that had arrived without a return address. Wrapped in brown paper and secured with twine, it had been left at the front desk some time before dawn. "No idea who dropped it off," the receptionist explained, as Emily turned the package over in her hands. "Security cameras were down for maintenance last night. When Professor Michael Turner arrived, they carefully opened it together. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age. The professor's eyes widened as he flipped through it. Each page contained meticulously coded notes, strange symbols, and hand-drawn diagrams of what appeared to be the Academy's grounds. "This is extraordinary," Michael whispered, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned another page. "Someone from the inside wanted us to find this?" Emily leaned closer, her historian's training immediately recognizing the significance. "Look here," she pointed to a series of initials scrawled in the margins. M-E-C-D-L-R. "These match the names we've been finding." Detective Richard Hayes arrived shortly after their call, his weathered face grave as he examined the journal. The retired investigator's pulse quickened when he spotted a recurring phrase, "the fifth girl." It appeared repeatedly throughout the coded text, always circled in red ink. "Whoever sent this knows we're investigating," Richard said, running his hand through his grey hair. "They've been watching our progress." Emily carefully photographed each page before attempting any translation. "The handwriting suggests someone elderly," she noted. "Perhaps a former staff member?" "Someone who's carried this secret for decades," Michael added, "but couldn't take it to the grave." Richard studied the diagrams intently. "They're too afraid to come forward directly. The town's old guard still has influence here." As they worked into the evening, the team realized the journal contained a systematic record, dates, locations, and cryptic references to transfers and special cases. The historian's hands shook slightly as she connected these entries to the dates from the memorandum they'd found earlier. "Whoever sent this," Richard said quietly, "is giving us a map to follow. They want the truth out, but they're still terrified of the consequences." Michael nodded solemnly. After 60 years of silence, someone's conscience has finally broken. The journal lay open between them, its secrets beginning to unravel. A silent witness, finally finding its voice in the dim light of the archive room. Emily Carter hunched over the journal for the third straight night, her desk lamp casting long shadows across her apartment walls. Her eyes burned from strain, but determination kept her focused on the coded passages. When the pattern finally clicked, she nearly knocked over her coffee mug. "New arrivals, who never received visitors," she whispered, transcribing the decoded text. The phrasing sent a chill through her body. These weren't just students. They were isolated, cut off from the outside world entirely. She immediately called Michael Turner, who answered despite the late hour. "Michael, these girls weren't just transferred. They were deliberately kept from having any contact with the outside," the historian explained, her voice tight with urgency. "The orphanage didn't just send them away, they erased them." The professor arrived at her apartment within 30 minutes, his hair uncombed and jacket hastily thrown over pajamas. Together they pored over the journal's pages, finding more references to the secretive transfers. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a hand-drawn diagram. "It's the academy's dormitory layout." The sketch showed corridors and rooms. But what caught their attention were the arrows pointing to a small chamber at the far end of the east wing. Notes in the margin, once decoded, read, "Initial processing, no records kept." "This room isn't on any blueprint we've seen," Michael muttered, comparing it to the official school plans they'd obtained. Emily traced the arrows with her finger. "A holding area, maybe, somewhere to keep the girls before..." "Before what?" Michael asked, the question hanging heavy between them. They called Detective Richard Hayes, who arrived with a thermos of coffee and his weathered notebook. The retired detective studied the diagram silently, his expression darkening. "We need to see this room," Hayes finally said. "If it exists, it might hold physical evidence the documents don't." Emily nodded. "The academy building is still standing, abandoned since the 80s, but structurally intact. If they were hiding something important enough to erase from official records," Michael added, "they might have left traces they couldn't remove from the physical space." Hayes closed the journal carefully. "I'll arrange access first thing tomorrow. This isn't just about missing records anymore. It's about a facility designed to make children disappear." Emily felt a shiver run through her. The photograph that had started everything now seemed like just the surface of a much darker story. Whatever had happened at Bryville Girls' Academy, the building itself might be the only witness left. "The academy isn't just where this happened," she said quietly. "It's part of how it happened. The abandoned Briarville Girls' Academy stood like a ghost against the autumn sky, its brick facade crumbling under decades of neglect. Professor Michael Turner shivered as he pushed open the heavy front door, which groaned in protest. Emily Carter and Detective Richard Hayes followed close behind, their flashlights cutting through the darkness that had settled into every corner. "The building's been empty since 1987, Emily whispered, her voice echoing down the hallway. The historian ran her fingers along the dusty wall, feeling the building's secrets beneath her touch. Richard consulted the hand-drawn diagram from the anonymous journal. "The dormitories should be up those stairs," he said, pointing toward a grand staircase whose banister was now wrapped in cobwebs. The trio moved carefully through the abandoned school, their footsteps disturbing years of silence. Classrooms still held desks arranged in neat rows, as if waiting for students who would never return. Faded portraits of stern-faced headmistresses watched their intrusion with painted disapproval. "According to the diagram, there should be a storage closet at the end of this corridor," Michael said, checking the journal against their surroundings. The professor's academic precision hadn't wavered, even in these unsettling conditions. Emily's flashlight beam landed on a narrow door, almost invisible against the panelled wall. She tried the handle, locked. Richard stepped forward with a small set of tools, and within moments the lock surrendered. The closet was small but deep, lined with shelves that still held stacks of yellowed papers and forgotten textbooks. Emily's trained eye caught something in the back corner, fabric, folded neatly despite the decades of abandonment. She pulled it out carefully, a school uniform, its navy blue color faded to a ghostly gray. "Look," she breathed, turning the collar inside out. "There." Stitched in faded thread was a name tag, C. Dalton. Michael's face paled. "Clara Dalton. She's one of the 5 girls who supposedly transferred." The uniform felt heavy in Emily's hands, weighted with implications. This wasn't just evidence. It was a connection to a life interrupted, to a girl who had worn this uniform and then vanished from all records. The next morning, the discovery sent shockwaves through Briarville. News traveled quickly in small towns, and by afternoon, Margaret Dalton stood trembling in the Historical Society's main room, her eyes fixed on the uniform that had belonged to her sister. 57 years, Margaret whispered, touching the fabric with weathered fingers. "They told us she was transferred to a better school. Then they said all records were lost in a fire." Her voice hardened. "I want answers. Now." The elderly woman's demand echoed through the building, reaching the town council members who had already gathered in emergency session. The past, so carefully buried, was rising to the surface, and Briarville would never be the same. Margaret Dalton's public confrontation with the town council transformed what had been a quiet historical investigation into front-page news across Briarville. The morning after her emotional testimony, residents gathered in small clusters outside the local diner, their hushed conversations punctuated by occasional glances toward the Historical Society building. "This is nothing but a witch hunt," declared Harold Winters, whose father had served on the Academy's board in the 50s. "That school saved countless troubled girls. My own aunt taught there for 20 years. His voice carried across Main Street, deliberately loud enough for Emily Carter to hear as she walked to her car. Emily merely nodded politely, clutching her files closer. The polarization of the town was happening exactly as Richard Hayes had predicted. When secrets this old start coming loose, the detective had warned, people choose sides based on what they can live with believing. By midweek, the Historical Society's phone rang constantly. Professor Michael Turner found himself overwhelmed by callers, some threatening legal action if the investigation continued, others offering information in trembling voices. The professor established a careful logging system, recording each interaction with the methodical precision that had become his trademark. "They're scared," Richard observed, reviewing Michael's notes. "Not just of what we'll find, but of their own complicity in staying silent all these years." The breakthrough came when Eliza Jennings, 87 and frail but clear-eyed, arrived at the society with a shoebox of letters. "Idri, my sister, worked in the academy kitchen," she explained, hands shaking as she removed the yellowed envelopes. "She wrote to me about girls who disappeared overnight. The headmistress told the staff they'd been transferred, but their belongings remained untouched." That same afternoon, a retired janitor delivered his grandfather's diary, containing disturbing entries about midnight deliveries to the academy's rear entrance. A former postal worker brought forward records of unusual packages sent from the school to addresses that, when checked, didn't exist. Emily spent hours with each witness, her historian's objectivity tested by the raw emotion in their stories. "It's like the whole town has been holding its breath for 70 years, she told Michael as they catalogued the growing evidence. Margaret visited daily, sometimes sitting silently as new testimonies arrived. When the former school nurse's daughter delivered medical records showing unexplained treatments for girls whose names matched their list, Margaret wept quietly. "They knew," she whispered, clutching Emily's hand. "All this time, somebody knew what happened to Clara and said nothing." The wall of silence that had protected Briarville's darkest secret was crumbling, one confession at a time. The results came back from the forensic lab with a conclusive report that silenced any remaining skeptics. The photograph from 1951 was unquestionably authentic. No digital manipulation, no clever forgery, not even the slightest alteration to the original image. The lab technician had highlighted the numbered tags in his analysis, confirming they were part of the original photograph, stitched into the uniforms at the time the picture was taken. Professor Michael Turner spread the forensic report across the conference table at the Briarville Historical Society's monthly meeting. The board members, mostly elderly residents with deep ties to the town, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This isn't just history anymore," Michael said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "These were real girls, with real families, who never knew what happened to them. We have a moral obligation to expose the truth." The board chairman, a retired banker whose grandfather had once served on the town council, cleared his throat. "Professor, we appreciate your diligence, but consider what this could do to Briarville's reputation. The academy was the pride of this community for generations." Emily Carter, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. The historian's usual academic reserve had given way to something fiercer. "With all due respect," she said, meeting each board member's gaze, "reputations don't trump human lives. Those girls deserve better then, and they deserve better now." The room fell silent. A woman at the end of the table, whose mother had attended the academy in the 60s, slowly nodded. "What exactly are you proposing?" the chairman finally asked. Michael outlined their plan, a comprehensive public report, outreach to surviving families, and a formal request for law enforcement to reopen the investigation. Several board members visibly paled at the mention of police involvement. "This will tear the town apart," one warned. Emily placed the photograph on the table. "It's already torn apart. The families of these girls have lived with unanswered questions for decades. We're just making the tear visible." The vote was closer than it should have been, 7-5 in favor of full disclosure. As the meeting adjourned, the chairman pulled Michael aside. "And I hope you understand what you're unleashing," he murmured. Michael watched as Emily carefully placed the photograph back in its protective sleeve. "What we're unleashing," he replied, "is the truth. It's been waiting 70 years to be heard." As they left the building, Detective Richard Hayes was waiting in his car across the street. The retired officer rolled down his window, eyebrows raised in question. Emily gave him a thumbs up. "We're going public." Richard Hayes hunched over his desk at the Briarville Historical Society, surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers. 3 weeks of methodical investigation had revealed a pattern more disturbing than anything in his decades as a detective. Every official record of the 5 missing girls had been systematically altered, not haphazardly, but with clinical precision. "It wasn't just carelessness," he explained, spreading documents across the table where Emily Carter and Michael Turner sat. Birth certificates were rewritten, school attendance logs modified, even hospital records show mysterious gaps. The detective pointed to Clara Dalton's file, where an entire section had been physically cut out and replaced with typed notes about a successful transfer to relatives in Ohio. Emily's stomach tightened as she examined each falsified document. The historian in her recognized the methodical destruction of evidence, while the human being in her recoiled at the calculated erasure of young lives. She'd spent years studying historical revisionism, but seeing it applied to children she now felt connected to was different. "Someone went through extraordinary lengths," Michael observed, adjusting his glasses as he compared original fragments with altered versions. This required access to multiple government offices, school administrations, even medical facilities. Richard nodded grimly. This wasn't the work of one person. The town leadership had to be involved. That night, Emily sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by photocopies of the altered records. Her training had taught her to maintain professional distance, to analyze evidence dispassionately. But Margaret Dalton's tear-streaked face kept appearing in her mind. The woman had called 3 times that week, desperate for updates about her sister. "I promised her answers," Emily whispered to the empty room, "but what if the truth only brings more pain?" She'd built her career on historical objectivity, on letting facts speak without emotional interpretation. Now, families like Margaret's looked to her not just for information, but for justice and closure. Their trust felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. When her phone rang, Emily knew who it was before answering. "Did you find anything new about Clara?" Margaret's voice trembled with hope. Emily closed her eyes, torn between sharing the brutal truth about the systematic cover-up and protecting this woman who had already suffered so much. The line between professional detachment and basic human compassion had never felt so blurred. "We're making progress," she finally said, knowing that each revelation would both heal and reopen wounds. "But Margaret, I need you to be prepared. What we're finding suggests this goes deeper than we imagined." Emily Carter sat hunched over the tattered journal, her eyes burning from hours of scrutiny. The dim basement light of the Briarville Historical Society cast long shadows across the pages. Her finger traced a list of initials hidden between coded entries, initials that didn't match any of the 5 girls they'd already identified. "Michael, look at this," she called, her voice tight with exhaustion. Professor Turner abandoned his stack of documents and joined her, adjusting his glasses as he leaned in. "JMPRST, these aren't on any of our lists." The historian's heart sank as she counted. 8 new sets of initials, each followed by dates and cryptic notations. If these represented additional girls, the scope of what happened at Briarville Girls Academy was far more extensive than they'd imagined. "We need to cross-reference these with every record we have," Michael said, his face drawn with concern. "County birth records, school enrollments, anything." Emily nodded, but her hands trembled slightly as she copied the initials into her notebook. 3 sleepless nights had left her nerves frayed. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces from the photograph. Young girls whose stories had been deliberately erased. Richard Hayes arrived the next morning with coffee for everyone. The retired detective noticed Emily's exhaustion immediately. "You need to pace yourself," he advised, placing a cup beside her computer. "I've seen investigators burn out on cold cases. This isn't a sprint." "These girls waited 70 years for someone to notice them," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can handle a few missed nights of sleep." Across the room, Michael stared at the enlarged photograph on his monitor. As a professor who had dedicated his life to preserving history, the realization that he had unwittingly participated in a system that buried these stories weighed heavily on him. "I've walked past this building thousands of times," he confessed to Richard. "I've written papers on Briarville's exemplary educational history. Never once questioned why certain records were missing." The detective placed a weathered hand on Michael's shoulder. "That's how these cover-ups work. They become invisible, part of the landscape." Emily looked up from the journal, her determination visibly fighting against her fatigue. The Academy didn't just take in orphans. These new initials suggest they were systematically removing girls from the records. The question is why? The three investigators exchanged glances, the unspoken possibilities hanging in the air between them. Whatever had happened at the Academy went beyond administrative negligence or isolated incidents. The patterns emerging pointed to something organized, deliberate, and chilling in its execution. "We need to find anyone still alive who worked there," Emily said, reaching for her phone. "Someone knows what these initials mean." Richard Hayes hunched over his desk at 3 in the morning. Surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers, his persistence had finally paid off. Buried in a box of miscellaneous town records, ones that should have been destroyed decades ago, he'd found minutes from a closed-door town council meeting dated February 12th, 1952. "I've got it," he said hoarsely into his phone. "The smoking gun." Hours later, Emily Carter and Professor Michael Turner gathered in Richard's living room, staring at the document protected in a clear plastic sleeve. The former detective's hands trembled slightly as he pointed to the damning paragraph. "The Council unanimously agrees that any unpleasantness regarding the Academy's special arrangements shall remain confidential to protect Briarville's reputation and economic interests," Emily read aloud, her voice catching. "Signed by Mayor Wilson and 7 council members." Michael removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "They knew. The whole town leadership knew something was wrong and deliberately covered it up." "Not just covered up," Richard corrected, his decades of investigative experience evident in his tone. "They actively participated. Look at the attendance list." Emily scanned the names and gasped. The head of the local police, the county judge, even the editor of the Briarville Gazette, all present, all complicit. "This changes everything," she whispered. Now, this wasn't just the Academy acting alone. It was systematic. Michael paced the room, the weight of historical responsibility heavy on his shoulders. "We have to take this to the FBI. These weren't just missing records. This was conspiracy across multiple institutions." The 3 investigators sat in silence, the enormity of their discovery settling around them. What had begun as a curious anomaly in an old photograph had unraveled the foundation of Briarville's carefully maintained image. 2 days later, agents from the Bureau's Cold Case Division arrived in town. The evidence Richard had uncovered was enough to officially reopen investigations into the disappearances. As word spread through Briarville, the Historical Society's phone rang constantly with reporters, concerned citizens, and people claiming to have information. "We've started something that can't be undone," Emily told Margaret Dalton over coffee, watching the older woman's eyes fill with tears of vindication. That evening, Michael stood at his window, watching FBI agents carry boxes of evidence from the town hall. "For better or worse," he murmured to himself. Briarville will never be the same. None of them had anticipated becoming the center of a federal investigation, but as Richard often reminded them, the truth was never meant to stay buried forever. The Briarville Historical Society's once quiet halls now echoed with voices seeking answers. Within days of the case becoming public, families who had spent decades wondering about their missing daughters, sisters, and friends arrived with trembling hands and weathered photographs, desperate for closure. Emily Carter watched as Margaret Dalton carefully unfolded the tissue paper surrounding Clara's uniform. The faded blue fabric with C. Dalton stitched inside seemed impossibly small in Margaret's weathered hands. The older woman traced the lettering with her fingertip, her shoulders shaking as silent tears streamed down her face. "I used to imagine her growing up somewhere beautiful," Margaret whispered, clutching the uniform to her chest. "I told myself she was adopted by a wealthy family, that she had opportunities I never could have given her." Her voice broke. "But she was here all along, wasn't she? Just miles away." Emily placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder, the historian in her momentarily overshadowed by simple human compassion. "We don't know everything yet," she said softly, "but we're going to find out what happened to Clara. I promise you that." Professor Michael Turner observed the interaction from across the room, his own emotions in turmoil. He'd spent his career preserving history, but never before had it felt so raw, so present. The academic distance he'd always maintained was crumbling as he watched families confront tangible evidence of their losses. "It's different when you can touch it," he murmured to Detective Richard Hayes, who stood beside him reviewing case notes. "History becomes real." The retired detective nodded grimly. "That's why cold cases haunt you. It's never just about evidence, it's about the people left behind." Throughout the day, Emily found herself moving between her role as investigator and unexpected counselor. One elderly woman brought in a Christmas card from 1950, the last correspondence from her cousin before she transferred. Another family arrived with birth certificates and school photos, hoping to match them with the faces in the academy photograph. Each revelation seemed to both heal and wound anew. The truth they'd uncovered offered validation to families who'd been dismissed for decades, yet simultaneously confirmed their worst fears. That evening, after the last visitors had gone, Emily sat alone with her notes, her professional objectivity wavering. The historical significance of their discovery was undeniable, but the human cost weighed heavily on her shoulders. "You're doing the right thing," Margaret had told her before leaving. "Even if it hurts, knowing is better than wondering forever." Emily hoped desperately that Margaret was right. The revelation about Briarville Girls' Academy swept through town like a cold wind, transforming the once proud community into a place of uncomfortable self-reflection. Long-time residents who had displayed their academy graduation photos prominently in living rooms now studied them with new eyes, searching for clues they might have missed decades ago. Former students gathered at Briarville's only diner, their coffee growing cold as they exchanged stories, wondering if they had been unwitting witnesses to something sinister. "I remember that locked room on the 3rd floor," one woman confessed, her hands trembling around her cup. "We were told it was for storage, but no one ever went in or out." Emily Carter received a handwritten note from a 70-year-old alumna who recalled a classmate vanishing mid-semester. "They told us she transferred to live with relatives in California. We never questioned it." The historian found herself at the center of a moral storm. Some townspeople crossed the street to avoid her, while others approached with tearful gratitude. The telephone at the Historical Society rang constantly. Half the calls were threats, the other half confessions. Professor Michael Turner faced the brunt of the elders' anger. The mayor himself cornered Michael outside the grocery store, jabbing a finger into his chest. You're destroying this town's reputation based on some stitched numbers and conspiracy theories, he hissed. My mother was on that school board. Are you calling her a criminal? Yet for every angry confrontation, there came quiet moments of vindication. An elderly man approached Michael after church, shaking his hand firmly. My sister went to that academy, he whispered. She tried to tell our parents something wasn't right. Nobody listened. She's been gone 50 years now. But I think she'd thank you. Detective Richard Hayes weathered the storm with stoic determination. His decades in law enforcement had prepared him for community backlash. Truth always costs something, he told Emily over coffee in the basement archive. But burying it costs more. The investigation had transformed Briarville. Neighbors who had exchanged pleasantries for decades now regarded each other with suspicion. Who knew? Who helped cover it up? The questions hung in the air at town meetings and Sunday services. Margaret Dalton found herself unexpectedly embraced by other families with missing pieces in their histories. Together, they formed a support group that met weekly in the library's community room. For years, I thought I was crazy for not believing the official story about Clara, Margaret told Emily during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. Now I know I wasn't alone in my doubts. The cost of honesty was indeed steep. Broken friendships, shattered reputations, a town divided. But as Emily reminded Michael when doubt crept in, the decades of silence had exacted a far greater price from the forgotten girls and the families who never stopped wondering. The final pages of the anonymous journal sent shivers down Emily Carter's spine. Hunched over the desk at Briarville Historical Society, she traced her finger across the faded ink, a meticulously coded list of dates and initials she hadn't noticed before. Each entry followed the same pattern: a date, 2 initials, and a sequence of numbers similar to those found on the uniform tags. "Michael, look at this," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Professor Michael Turner adjusted his reading glasses and leaned over her shoulder, his expression darkening as he understood the implications. "These aren't just records of the 5 girls we know about," he said. "If I'm reading this correctly, there could be dozens more." They called Detective Richard Hayes immediately. The retired investigator arrived within the hour, his weathered notebook already in hand. When presented with the journal's final pages, the detective's face grew grim. "I spent 30 years on the force," Richard muttered. "Oh, and missed this happening in our own backyard." He tapped his pen against the coded entries. Each of these could be another child who disappeared without anyone connecting the dots. The team worked through the night, cross-referencing the initials against every record they could access. By dawn, they had identified 3 more girls who had supposedly been transferred from the orphanage but never reached their destinations. "The pattern spans nearly a decade," Emily explained, pushing a strand of hair from her exhausted face. "It didn't stop in 51 or 52. It continued." Richard paced the archive room, his determination visible in every step. "I'm going to contact every family member I can find," he announced. "Every lead, no matter how cold, deserves to be followed. I owe them that much." The following afternoon, Emily met with Margaret Dalton at the small cafe across from the Historical Society. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she sipped her coffee, still processing the truth about her sister Clara. "We've found evidence of more girls," Emily said gently. "The investigation is growing." Margaret set down her cup. "Will they all get their names back, their stories?" Emily reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "I promise you," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "We won't stop until every single one of these girls is identified. They deserve to be more than just initials in a hidden journal." That evening, as the 3 investigators pinned new photographs and timelines to their evidence board, They understood with solemn clarity that their discovery had only opened the first door. Behind it lay a labyrinth of secrets that would demand months, perhaps years, to fully unravel. The first snow of winter dusted Briarville's streets as Professor Michael Turner gazed through the Historical Society's frosted windows. Outside, the town had transformed, not just by the weather, but by something deeper. Conversations in the local diner no longer hushed when Emily Carter entered. Instead, elderly residents would approach her, offering faded photographs and whispered memories. "It's like the dam finally broke," Emily said, pinning another newspaper clipping to the wall. 6 months ago, nobody would acknowledge these girls existed. The storage room that had once been merely a repository for forgotten artifacts now hummed with purpose. Where dust-covered boxes had stood, investigation boards stretched from floor to ceiling, timelines crisscrossed the walls, photographs of young faces stared out from yellowed paper, and red string connected names to dates to locations. The detective had jokingly called it their war room during his last visit, but the name had stuck. Richard Hayes spent most afternoons there now, his retirement forgotten as he meticulously cross-referenced each new piece of information. His notebook had expanded to 3, each filled with the careful handwriting of a man determined to leave no stone unturned. "The council meeting's been rescheduled again," Michael announced, hanging up the phone. "They're still trying to control the narrative." Emily nodded, unsurprised. "But they can't anymore. Not with Margaret leading the families." Margaret Dalton had emerged as an unexpected force. The quiet woman who had once visited the Historical Society in tears now organized weekly gatherings for relatives of the missing girls. Her living room had become a sanctuary where grief could be shared openly, where decades of silence were finally broken. 27 names, Richard murmured, updating their master list. 27 girls who deserved better than to be erased. The historian placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She understood the weight he carried. They all did. Each name they uncovered was both a victory and a wound reopened. Outside, Briarville's streets grew quieter under the thickening snow, but inside homes and shops, at church gatherings and school board meetings, the conversations continued. Some residents still defended the old institutions, claiming ignorance or necessity, but most now spoke of responsibility, of collective failure, of how a town could look away for so long. "Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing," Michael confessed late one evening, his breath fogging in the chilly room. Emily looked up from Clara Dalton's file. "The right thing would have been saving those girls 70 years ago," she said softly. This is just the next best thing we can do." 6 months after that first fateful scan, Briarville's town hall stood transformed. Where polite silence once reigned, truth now demanded acknowledgement. Professor Michael Turner adjusted his glasses, surveying the packed room where photographs of the missing girls had been arranged on easels, each face now bearing a name, a story, a life reclaimed from obscurity. Emily Carter stood beside the podium, her fingers tracing the edge of the original photograph that had started everything. The historian's sleepless nights had finally yielded results. 4 of the missing girls positively identified, their fates documented, their existence no longer erased from history. "We gather today, not just to remember," Emily began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion, "but to restore what was taken, the simple dignity of being remembered." The families sat in the front row, some elderly now, others representing younger generations who'd grown up with only whispered stories of missing aunts and cousins. Margaret Dalton clutched a small framed picture of her sister Clara, tears streaming silently down her weathered face. When Emily had first placed Clara's recovered uniform in her hands months earlier, Margaret had collapsed with grief. Today, she sat tall, vindicated at last. Detective Richard Hayes stood at the back, his notebook finally closed. The retired investigator had pursued every lead with relentless determination, forcing open sealed records and confronting former officials whose memories had suddenly grown convenient gaps. His work had given names to the nameless, dates to the vanished. These girls were not statistics, Michael said when his turn came to speak. They were daughters, sisters, friends. Their disappearances were not accidents, but choices made by those who valued reputation over humanity. Several town council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The investigation had exposed decades of institutional complicity, revealing how Briarville's leadership had systematically buried evidence to protect the town's image. After the ceremony, Emily found herself alone with the photograph that had started everything. She studied the faces of the 24 girls. Now knowing the stories behind 4 of them, the tiny stitched numbers that had first caught Michael's attention remained visible under magnification, silent testimony to a system that had reduced children to inventory. "We're not finished," Richard said, approaching quietly. 20 more stories to uncover." Emily nodded, determination replacing fatigue. What had begun as a simple digitization project had become their life's work. The photograph that had haunted Briarville for decades was finally speaking its truth, not because the evidence hadn't been there all along, but because someone had finally chosen to look closer, to see what others had deliberately overlooked.